The morning Ruth Calloway's sons drove away, the temperature was 31 degrees, and the sky was the color of old pewter pressing down flat over the county. She stood in the driveway of the house she had lived in for 41 years and watched the taillights of Marcus's truck disappear around the bend in Sycamore Road, and she did not cry. She had already cried. She had done that alone in the upstairs bathroom 2 nights before, sitting on the edge of the tub with the faucet running so no one would hear. That was the last of it. What was left now was something quieter and harder than grief, more like the feeling of a door shutting in a room you will never enter again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 78 years old. She had raised 2 boys in this house, buried a husband in the county cemetery 4 miles east, grown a garden in the side yard for 37 consecutive springs, and kept every bill paid on time. She had never asked anyone for more than was fair. That had not been enough. The conversation had begun in late August, the way these conversations always begin, softly and with the word concerned threaded through every sentence. Marcus had flown in from Phoenix and Joel had driven up from Raleigh, and they had sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee she had made them and explained, in careful rotating turns, that they were worried about her living alone, that the house was too large, that the winters were getting harder, that there was a very good facility in Greensboro with a dining room and activities and a nurse on call at all hours. Ruth had listened without interrupting. She had looked at her sons' faces, at the way Marcus kept glancing at Joel whenever he stopped talking, at the way Joel kept his hands wrapped around his mug, as if anchoring himself to something. She had understood, in the way a woman who has watched people long enough comes to understand things before they are fully said, that the conversation had already been finished before it began. They had not come to ask. They had come to inform. She said she would think about it. They said good. They said that was all they were asking. 3 weeks later, Marcus called to say he had already spoken to a real estate agent. The house would list in October. It would sell quickly in this market, he said. That was good news. Ruth did not argue on the phone. She said she understood. She set the receiver down and stood for a long moment in the kitchen with her hand still resting on it. She did not go to Greensboro. What Ruth Calloway did instead was drive 40 minutes south on a Tuesday morning to the town of Harnett Crossing, population 900 and falling, and stand in front of a building that no one in the county had thought about in a very long time. It had been a jail once, not a large one. Harnett Crossing had never been a large enough town to require a large jail. It was a 2-story brick structure on the corner of Depot Street and what used to be called Mill Road, built sometime in the early 1900s when the county still had a functioning timber operation and enough trouble on Friday nights to need somewhere to put it. The brick was dark with decades of grime and weather. The windows on the upper floor were boarded shut with plywood that had gone gray and soft at the corners. The iron bars were still visible behind the boards on the lower windows, thick round bars set in concrete, dark orange with rust but solid. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, one section bowed outward as if something had pressed against it long enough and hard enough to leave a permanent lean. A hand-painted sign on the fence read, "For sale county property, inquire Harnett CO, clerk's office." The asking price, according to the single sheet of paper the county clerk's assistant had handed Ruth without much ceremony, was $6. $6 in back taxes owed, payable upon transfer of deed. The county had been trying to offload the property for 11 years. No one wanted it. Ruth stood at the fence for a long time. The wind moved through the bare branches of the elm tree at the corner of the property and made a sound like paper being slowly torn. She was wearing her good wool coat, the charcoal one with the wide lapels that she had bought for Harold's funeral and had worn to nothing else since. Her hands were in her pockets. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. She was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She had been careful her entire adult life. She had kept a budget in a small green ledger and balanced it every month. She had measured twice before cutting anything. She had stayed in a marriage for 43 years through difficulty and tenderness, and the long, ordinary middle ground between those things. Careful was the word people had always used for her, and she had worn it like a coat of her own. But standing at that fence on that gray Tuesday morning, Ruth understood something that careful people sometimes take too long to understand. There was nothing left to be careful with. Her sons had taken the calculus of her remaining life and done the math themselves. The house would sell. The Greensboro facility had a waiting list. The decision had already been made in rooms she had not been invited into. So she looked at the building on the corner of Depot Street for a long time, and she felt something she had not felt in months. Not hope, not yet. Something earlier than hope. The thing that comes before hope, when a person has nothing to protect and therefore nothing to lose and therefore, for the first time in a very long while, nothing to be afraid of. She went inside the county clerk's office and paid $6. Marcus called that evening while she was heating soup. She let him talk for a while about the listing photos and the agent's opinion of the market. Then she told him she had purchased a property in Harnett Crossing. There was a pause. What kind of property? He asked. The old county jail on Depot Street. Another pause, longer. Mom. Yes. That building has been abandoned for decades. 32 years, the clerk told me. Marcus's voice had the particular quality it got when he was trying to remain patient while something inside him was moving toward impatience at considerable speed. He had had that voice since he was 14 years old, and she had always known exactly what it meant. You can't live in a jail, Mom. I'm not going to live in a jail, she said. I'm going to live in a building that used to be a jail. That is the same thing. It really isn't, she said. Good night, Marcus. She ate her soup. She watched the news. She went to bed at 9:30 and slept better than she had in 3 months. The following Monday, Ruth drove back to Harnett Crossing with a flashlight, a pair of work boots she had found in Harold's closet 2 sizes too large, but workable with 2 pairs of socks and a notebook. The county clerk's assistant had given her a key ring with 4 keys on it. None of them were labeled. She stood at the front door of the building, a heavy iron door painted over so many times the color had become indeterminate, and tried each one until the 3rd key turned. The smell that came out was decades thick. Damp concrete, and old metal, and something underneath both of those things that Ruth could not name precisely. Cold air that had been sitting in the same place for a long time and had gone stale with the sitting. She held her flashlight up and stepped inside. The entry room was larger than she had expected. High ceilings, maybe 12 feet. The floor was poured concrete, cracked in several places but intact. To her left was a heavy wooden desk built into the wall, the wood swollen and warped but still standing. To her right, a wooden bench ran the length of the wall, bolted to it with iron brackets. Ahead of her, a hallway stretched toward the back of the building, and on either side of the hallway were the cells. She walked slowly. Her flashlight moved across the walls, and she followed it with her eyes the way you might follow a hand pointing at things in the dark, making sure not to miss anything. The cells were small. 6 of them, 3 on each side of the hallway, each one maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. Iron doors, most of them standing open, the hinges red with rust. Inside each cell, a concrete shelf that had served as a bed. In a few of them, iron rings bolted to the wall. A high narrow window covered with bars. The paint on the walls inside the cells was a faded institutional green, and here and there someone had scratched letters or marks into it, though time and moisture had blurred most of them past reading. At the end of the hallway, stairs led upward. Ruth climbed them carefully, testing each step before trusting it with her full weight. The upper floor had been used as office space, she thought. There were 2 rooms, larger and less grim than the cells below, with actual windows boarded, but with real glass still intact behind the boards in one of them. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner of the larger room, a cast-iron thing set on a brick platform, the flue pipe disconnected from the chimney above, but otherwise intact. She stood in that upper room for a long time. Her flashlight beam found the stove, the window, the plank floor, the low beam running across the ceiling with a hook in it that had probably once held a lantern. She turned slowly, looking at everything. The building was not pretty. It was not charming. No one standing here would call it promising. Marcus would call it a money pit. Joel would call it a liability. The county clerk's assistant had clearly been relieved to be rid of it. Ruth looked at the iron stove. She looked at the plank floor, the boards worn smooth by years of use before the abandonment. She looked at the window, and through the crack in the board covering it she could see a thin line of pale sky. She opened her notebook and began to write. What she wrote was not a list of repairs, though that would come later. What she wrote first was something closer to a description what she saw, what the proportions were, what could become what. The way a woman who has kept house for 40 years and cooked 10,000 meals in someone else's vision of a kitchen begins to see, with very little effort, what a space could be if it were given the chance to become something other than what it had always been. Her handwriting was small and even. She filled 3 pages before the cold drove her back downstairs. She was locking the front door when she heard gravel shifting behind her. A man was standing at the fence. He was perhaps 60, built like someone who had done physical work for many years and still carried it in his shoulders. He was wearing a canvas jacket and a dark green cap, and he was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who has lived in a small town long enough to be curious about anything new without being comfortable about admitting it. "You bought this place?" he asked. She turned to face him. "I did." He looked at the building, then back at her. "For what?" "I haven't entirely decided yet," she said, "but I have some ideas." He studied her for a moment. His name, he would tell her a few minutes later, was Calhoun Briggs. He lived 2 streets over. He was a retired electrician. He had been watching this building sit empty since 1991 and had privately assumed it would continue to sit empty until it fell down. "You know the wiring in there is completely shot," he said. "I assumed as much. The plumbing, too. Pipes froze out a long time ago." "Yes. There's no insulation to speak of." Ruth looked at him. "Are you trying to discourage me?" He considered this. "No," he said. "I'm trying to see if you know what you're getting into." She pulled her coat a little tighter against the wind. "I know I'm getting into something large," she said. "I don't know yet whether it's too large. But I find that the only way to know that is to begin." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I did the wiring on the county library when they renovated it in 1998. I still have my license. I've got time on my hands most days." She looked at him steadily. "What would you want for it?" He shrugged. "My wife makes me eat lunch at home every day," he said, "and that's starting to wear on both of us. If you're planning to run any kind of kitchen in there, I wouldn't say no to eating somewhere else occasionally." Ruth allowed herself a small smile. That she could manage. His name went into the notebook that evening. Calhoun Briggs. Electrician. Retired. 2 streets over. She drove home through the early dark with the heater running and her notebook on the passenger seat, and she thought about the iron stove in the upper room. She thought about what a fire in it would look like. She thought about what the upper room would feel like with the boards off the window and the winter light coming through properly. She did not think about Marcus or Joel or the Greensboro facility. She had decided, somewhere between the 3rd page of the notebook and the conversation at the fence, that she was done managing other people's expectations of her life. Over the next 2 weeks, Ruth drove to Harnett Crossing every morning. She brought coffee in a thermos and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and she worked until the cold made her hands too stiff to continue. The first thing she did was clear the debris from the entryway. There was not a great deal of it. The building had been empty, not vandalized, but 32 years of small intrusions had accumulated. Dead leaves blown under the door gap, plaster that had fallen from a section of ceiling in the hallway, mouse droppings along the base of the walls. A broken wooden chair collapsed into kindling. She swept, filled trash bags, carried them out. She did not rush. Calhoun Briggs appeared on the second morning at 8:15 with his tool bag and a separate bag that turned out to contain 2 thermoses of coffee and his wife's opinion, delivered by proxy, that the building had good bones. He worked on the electrical panel first, which he said was not merely outdated but actually dangerous, a word he used without drama, but with the careful weight of someone who had seen what dangerous electrical panels do when given enough time. Ruth listened and made notes and agreed to the order of work without pretending to understand more of it than she did. She understood other things. She could see which of the cell walls were structural and which were not. She had looked up the building's original county records, found at the clerk's office in a folder that had not been opened in some years, and she knew the square footage, the original construction date 1908, and the names of the 2 contractors who had built it. She knew that the upper floor had been renovated in 1947 and again in 1963. She knew that the last prisoner had been held here in the winter of 1991, a detail she had found in an old issue of the county paper at the Harnett Crossing Library, a small building that was open 3 days a week and staffed by a woman named Doris who had given Ruth a library card before she had finished introducing herself. Ruth read everything she could find about the building, not because she needed the history to do the work, but because she believed that a place had a right to be known by the person who intended to change it. The cells on the lower floor she looked at for a long time before deciding anything. They were the part of the building that most people, she imagined, would see as the defining problem. Small barred rooms, concrete shelves, iron doors, the accumulated meaning of a place designed to hold people against their will. But Ruth had spent 41 years in a house where the rooms had also, in their quieter way, been designed for her by someone else. She had painted the walls the colors Harold chose. She had arranged the furniture in the configurations that made the space feel correct to him. She had been comfortable there, genuinely comfortable, and she had loved the house, and she had loved the man. But love and chosen are not the same word, and she understood that now in a way she had not found the language for while Harold was living. She stood in the hallway of the old jail, and she looked at the cells. She had an idea. It arrived not all at once, but in pieces, the way good ideas do. And the more pieces arrived, the more she understood that what she had here was not, despite all appearances, a limitation. It was a structure. And structure, in the hands of someone who knows how to work with it rather than against it, is an entirely different thing from a cage. She began to sketch in the notebook. It was the Thursday of the third week when she found the room. She had been working methodically through the building, measuring and noting and making decisions about what would stay and what would go. She had opened all the windows on the upper floor, removing the boards herself with a pry bar Calhoun had left behind, and the light that came in had changed the room so completely that she stood in it for 10 minutes before she could continue working. It was the kind of light that makes a person understand what the word spacious actually means, not large, but unobstructed, a room that does not lean in on you. She had come back downstairs and was measuring the wall at the far end of the hallway, past the last cell, when her tape measure snagged on something, and she knelt to look at the baseboard. The wall at the end of the hallway did not line up. She stood up and looked at it properly. From the outside of the building, she had paced the length of the wall. She had done it twice, because she was careful, and both times the number had been the same. But the interior measurement of the hallway was shorter than it should have been by roughly 11 feet. She stood very still and looked at the wall. She pressed her hand against the plaster. It was cold and slightly damp, the same as every other wall in the building. She knocked on it, moving her knuckles slowly from left to right. In the center, the sound changed. Just slightly. Just enough. Ruth went and got the pry bar. She did not attack the wall. She worked along the baseboard first, then at the seam where the plaster met the door frame of the last cell. She was not in a hurry. She was the kind of person who had always understood that haste is a form of disrespect toward the thing you are working with. You do not rush at something you do not yet understand. The plaster came away in sections. Behind it was older plaster, and behind that, brick. Not the same dark exterior brick of the building's walls, but interior brick, smaller and lighter in color, laid without mortar joints as wide as the outer walls. It had been put here intentionally, by someone who knew what they were doing, to close off this end of the hallway and reduce it to a blank wall. Ruth looked at the brick. She found the door 20 minutes later by running her hand along the left side of the brick section and feeling the iron frame recessed into the mortar at the edge. The door itself was brick too, same as the wall, set into the frame so precisely that from any distance it was invisible. The handle was a simple iron ring set into a mortise, painted over with the same institutional green as the rest of the hallway. She turned the ring. The door swung inward on hinges that moved with the slow, settled weight of something that has not been disturbed in a very long time, but was built properly enough to still function when asked. Cold air came out, darker than the hallway, smelling of iron and wood and something else underneath that she stood at the threshold for a moment trying to identify. She stepped inside. The room was long and narrow, running the full 11 feet she had been missing from the hallway measurement and the same width as the hallway itself. The ceiling was lower than the rest of the building, perhaps 8 feet. The floor was wood rather than concrete, wide plank boards, and they were in remarkable condition, she would realize later, because the sealed room had kept the moisture and temperature more stable than the rest of the building. Along the right wall, from floor to nearly ceiling, were shelves. Rough-cut lumber shelves, built directly into the wall studs, sturdy and straight. And on the shelves were things. Ruth held up her flashlight and looked. The shelves held tools. Not a random collection of forgotten equipment, but a complete and organized set of woodworking tools. Planes of various sizes arranged by length. Chisels in a wooden rack, each one still wrapped at the handle with leather grip tape. Draw knives. Spoke shaves. A shoulder vise mounted to a section of wall that had been thickened with an added plank to accommodate it. A miter box with a back saw still resting in it. A set of wooden-bodied molding planes, 12 of them, arranged in a row along the top shelf with their irons pointing down to protect the edges. And beneath the shelves, on the floor, pieces of wood. Not scraps. Carefully dimensioned lumber, stickered for air circulation, the way a woodworker stacks wood for drying. Cherry. Walnut. A section of figured maple, wide and clear. Ruth moved the flashlight slowly. She was not rushing. On the left wall, above a narrow workbench built into the studs the same way the shelves on the right had been, there were two things hanging on iron pegs. The first was a canvas apron, dark with years of absorbed oil and sawdust, the strings hanging loose. The second was a photograph. Ruth reached up and unhooked the photograph from its peg. It was in a small wood frame, handmade. She could see the dovetails at the corners, and behind the glass was a black and white photograph of a man standing at a workbench. He was perhaps 50 in the photograph, broad-shouldered, with his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a plane in his right hand. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at whatever was on the bench in front of him, and his face had the particular quality of expression that a person has when they are entirely absorbed in work they have chosen and love. She turned the frame over. On the back, in pencil, in a handwriting she did not recognize, Elroy Pratt, 1962. She stood in the hidden room for a long time after that, holding the photograph in both hands, the flashlight balanced on the workbench, casting its beam at the ceiling and diffusing into a general pale light that showed her everything. Elroy Pratt. She said the name out loud, once, quietly, in the sealed room that had been holding his things for longer than she had been a resident of Harnett County. She did not know yet who he was. She would find out. But she knew something already, standing there in that hidden room with the tools arranged with such care, and the wood stickered so precisely, and the photograph of a man in love with what he was doing. She knew that whoever had put these things here had done so with the intention that they would be found by someone who would understand what they were. She put the photograph carefully under her arm. She went back out into the hallway, and she stood for a moment in the cold air of the building that she had bought for $6 and that no one had believed in, and that had, in the space of 20 minutes, become something entirely different from what any of them had imagined. Then she opened her notebook and began, very carefully, to write down what she had seen. She wrote the dimensions of the room. She wrote each tool she could identify by name. She wrote the species of wood on the floor and the approximate dimensions of each stickered piece. She wrote the name from the photograph. She noted the dovetailed frame and the quality of its construction, the way the joints were cut tight enough that no gap showed at any corner. She was still writing when she heard Calhoun's truck on the gravel outside. He came in through the front door and found her in the hallway, writing in the notebook with the flashlight tucked under her chin. He looked past her at the open door at the end of the hallway that had not been there yesterday. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I always wondered why this hallway felt short." "You knew?" "No," he said. "Only that something didn't add up. I never looked into it." He stepped past her into the hidden room, and she followed him back in. He moved the flashlight across the shelves the way she had. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Calhoun was not a man who filled silence carelessly. "These are good tools," he said finally. "Not antiques in the sense of decorative. Working tools. Someone kept them up." She showed him the photograph. He looked at it for a while. "Elroy Pratt," he said. "You know that name?" Calhoun handed the photograph back. "I know the name from the old-timers. He was a furniture maker. Had a shop somewhere north of town, I think, back in the 50s and 60s. Made chairs mostly. People said he was very good." He turned and looked at the shelves again. The tools, the wood, the mounted vise. "He must have used this room as a secondary workshop," Calhoun said, "or stored things here when the shop closed. Why seal it?" Calhoun considered. "Could be a lot of reasons. Keep the tools safe. Keep them dry. Keep them from walking away." He looked at her. Could be he intended to come back for them. But he didn't. Doesn't look like it. Ruth looked at the stickered lumber on the floor. The wood that someone had prepared carefully, oriented so it would continue drying properly even in the dark, even in the years of abandonment, because good wood properly stored will wait for the hands that intend to use it. She thought about that, about what it meant to prepare something carefully and entrust it to a room, to time, to whatever came next. She said, "I want to know more about him." Calhoun nodded. "Doris at the library is your best bet. She knows everything that ever happened in this county." He paused. "I'll be at the electrical panel if you need me." He left her there with the tools and the photograph and the notebook. Outside, The wind was picking up. She could hear it moving against the upper windows, that paper-tearing sound again. The elm tree at the corner doing what elm trees do in November wind. The building around her settled and creaked in the way that old brick buildings do, not ominously, but with the particular voice of something that has stood long enough to be comfortable in its own shifting. Ruth sat down on the edge of the narrow workbench, carefully, making sure it would hold, and it did. She looked at the tools on the shelves. She had always liked to work with her hands. Harold had not particularly noticed this about her, or if he had noticed, he had not considered it especially significant. She had sewn, she had gardened, she had refinished a set of kitchen chairs once and done it well, had sanded them smooth and applied 3 coats of paint and reupholstered the seats with a fabric she had chosen herself. Harold had said they looked nice. That had been the end of it. She looked at the planes on the shelf, at the chisels in their rack, at the set of molding planes lined up with their irons facing down. She was 78 years old. She had 2 sons who had decided her life was over and had begun making arrangements accordingly. She had $6 in a deed and a building that no one in Harnett County believed was worth anything. She looked at Elroy Pratt's tools. She thought about Margaret Brennan climbing up onto that steam engine. She had read the story once, years ago, in a magazine. A woman who had kept something running not because the world asked her to, but because she understood its value and intended to honor it. A machine that had sat waiting in a barn until the day it was needed, and then did the work that nothing modern could manage. These tools had been waiting too. In the dark, in the sealed room, in the years of forgetting. Ruth reached out and lifted one of the smaller planes from the shelf. It was a block plane, its irons still sharp from the last sharpening, the cap iron adjusted to a fine mouth. She turned it in her hands. It was heavy and balanced, and it fit her palm the way a good tool always does, as if the weight were distributed specifically to be useful. She did not know yet what she was going to build. She had the sketch in the notebook, the early idea that had come in pieces, but it was still forming itself, still finding its edges. She set the plane back on its shelf, exactly as she had found it. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote, at the bottom of the 3rd page, 2 words she had not planned to write until she understood better what she was doing. The words were, "I begin." She closed the notebook. She tucked the photograph of Elroy Pratt under her arm. She walked back out into the hallway, leaving the door to the hidden room open behind her, letting the cold air of the building move through it for the first time in 32 years. She could hear Calhoun working somewhere in the building, the sound of a socket wrench turning in the silence. She could smell, very faintly, the coffee still in her thermos on the front desk. She could see, through the new opening of the unboarded upper window, a strip of gray November sky. She walked toward the front of the building. She had a list to make and a library to visit and a retired electrician to pay in meals and a building to bring back from the quiet dark into which it had been allowed to sink. She was not rescued. She was not lucky. She was a woman with $6 and a key ring and a notebook and 41 years of knowing how to make something out of a room. She walked out into the cold air of Depot Street, locked the iron door behind her, and drove to the Harnett Crossing Library to find out who Elroy Pratt had been. Doris Henshaw had worked at the Harnett Crossing Public Library for 26 years, and she kept the kind of memory that small-town librarians sometimes develop when they have spent enough years watching what people look for and why. She was perhaps 65, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a cardigan the color of dried mustard, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent their professional lives in rooms where quiet is a form of courtesy. Ruth set the photograph on the desk in front of her and said the name. Doris looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked up at Ruth. "You bought that building." "I did." Doris took off her glasses and polished them on the hem of her cardigan and put them back on. "Elroy Pratt," she said. "He died in 1974. He was 61 years old. He had a furniture workshop on Pratt Road, which is named for his family, about 3 miles north of town. He made chairs, ladder-back chairs mostly, with woven seats, white oak splits. He also made tables, cabinets, a few pieces that people around here still have in their homes and treat like there's something precious, which they are." Ruth listened without writing. She wanted to hear it first before she put it down. "He was a good man," Doris said. "From what people have told me, and I'm getting this secondhand from people who knew him, he was the kind of craftsman who did not make anything he was not proud of. He had a waiting list. People came from 3 counties away to order chairs. He never raised his prices as much as he could have. He said the work was its own payment, and he only needed what was fair. What happened to the workshop? Doris folded her hands on the desk. He had a son, Raymond Pratt. Raymond was not interested in woodworking. He was interested in other things, faster things, things that required less patience. When Elroy died, the workshop sat empty for a few years, and then Raymond sold it, or sold the land. There may have been debts involved. The building itself came down sometime in the late 70s. There is a storage facility there now. And the tools? Doris looked at the photograph again. I didn't know about any tools. I knew he had a connection to the old jail building because his cousin was the county sheriff for a period. He may have had access to it for that reason. But I didn't know he had left anything there. He left everything there, Ruth said. Doris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think you should talk to Vera Sims. She's 83. She lives on the assisted living side of Cedarview, out on Route 9. She knew Elroy Pratt personally. She used to tell me that her kitchen table was one of his, and that she intended to be buried before she let anyone take it out of her house. Ruth wrote the name in her notebook. Vera Sims. Route 9. Cedarview. One more thing, Doris said. She got up from behind the desk and moved to a bank of filing cabinets against the back wall. She opened the second drawer from the bottom and searched through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows exactly what she has filed and where. She pulled out a manila folder and carried it back. Inside were 3 photocopied pages from what looked like a county agricultural fair program, dated 1968. One page had a photograph of a man standing beside a chair. The chair was tall and graceful, with a back made of 4 horizontal rungs that curved very slightly, the wood pale and clean, the woven seat in a herringbone pattern. The man was the same man as in Ruth's photograph, a little older, a little heavier in the face, still not looking at the camera. Best in craft, the caption read, Elroy Pratt, Harnett Crossing, white oak ladderback armchair. Ruth looked at the chair in the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. The proportions were exactly right. Not decorative right, not aesthetically clever right, but structurally and functionally right in a way that only happens when the person making a thing understands it from the inside. When the maker knows not just how to cut the wood, but why the wood wants to be cut that way. May I take a copy of this? Doris had already moved to the photocopier. Ruth visited Vera Sims the following morning. Cedarview was a low beige building set back from Route 9 behind a row of Bradford pear trees. And it smelled, as these places often do, of institutional warmth and something floral that was trying too hard. Ruth signed in at the front desk and was directed down a hallway to a corner room that was made considerably more habitable than the rest of the building by the presence, in its center, of a kitchen table. It was a Pratt table. Ruth knew it before she was told. The same quality of proportion, the same careful attention to how the wood had been used, the legs turned and tapered in a way that was functional first and beautiful second, which is the correct order. The top was thick cherry, the grain running the long way, and it had been used for many years and cared for with oil, and it glowed with the particular warmth that only comes from wood that has been both worked and loved. Vera Sims was small and bird-like in her chair with a wool blanket across her lap and eyes that were still very sharp. She looked at Ruth the way sharp-eyed old women look at other women of a certain age, with the quick assessment of someone who has seen enough to know immediately what kind of person she is dealing with. You bought the jail, she said. News travels in small towns along routes that have nothing to do with announcement. Ruth was beginning to understand this about Harnett Crossing. I did, she said. And you found Elroy's room. Ruth set the photograph on the table between them. Vera looked at it, and her face did something complicated and then settled. I haven't seen that photograph in years, she said. Where did you find it? Hanging on a peg in the hidden room. Ruth paused. How did you know about the room? Vera was quiet for a moment. Elroy told me about it, she said. Not long before he died. He told me he had moved things there for safekeeping when Raymond started making clear he didn't intend to continue the work. He didn't want Raymond to sell the tools the way he'd sold everything else. He said he knew someone would come eventually who would understand what they were. She looked at the photograph again. I thought he meant another woodworker. Someone who'd know the value of the planes and the chisels and the wood he'd dried. I didn't think about it being anyone else. Ruth said, I want to use them. Vera looked up. I want to learn what they're for, Ruth said. I want to learn it properly. And I want to make something with them in that building. I don't know yet exactly what, but I know it should exist. Vera studied her for a long moment. You're not a woodworker. No. Have you ever used a hand plane? Once, Ruth said. 40 years ago. My father had one. I used it on a door that was sticking. Vera almost smiled. Elroy would have said that counts. He believed that almost everyone could learn to work wood if they were patient enough to let the wood tell them something before they started cutting. She looked at the table in front of them. Her hand moved to the surface of it, resting there the way hands rest on things that are deeply familiar. He made this for me in 1966, she said. I was 38 years old and I had just gotten married and I could not afford what he charged, but he made it anyway and told me to pay him when I could. By the time I could afford it, he said the bill was settled and he wouldn't hear another word about it. She was quiet for a moment. He was going to teach a class, she said. He had talked about it for years. Teaching people in the county how to work with hand tools, how to read wood, how to make furniture that would last. He never did it. He ran out of time. Ruth looked at the table. She thought about the hidden room, the tools arranged with such care, the wood stickered for drying as if still expecting to be used. She thought about the word class. She thought about the cells on the lower floor of the building, those small rooms that she had been looking at and thinking about and sketching around in her notebook for 2 weeks. Something arrived in her mind that had been forming itself slowly and now found its final shape. She picked up her notebook. She began to write. Vera watched her. After a minute she said, "What are you writing?" "What it could be," Ruth said. "What the building could be." She wrote for several minutes while Vera sat quietly. Outside the window of the corner room, the Bradford pear trees moved in the November wind, their branches bare and angular against a pale sky. The table between them was warm and solid and had been there for nearly 60 years, which is what a well-made thing does when it is properly cared for. When Ruth stopped writing, she looked up and said, "Would you be willing to tell me more about how he worked? Not just what he made, how he made it, what he said about it." Vera looked at her steadily. "I would," she said, "but I want something in return." Ruth waited. "I want to see what you do with the building. I want someone to bring me there when it's ready. I want to sit in it." Ruth said, "I will come and get you myself." She drove back to Harnett Crossing with 3 pages of new notes and something that felt, cautiously, like a plan. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The work on the building accelerated through November and into December. Calhoun finished the electrical panel and began rewiring the upper floor while Ruth focused on the lower level, learning as she went in the methodical way she had always learned things, by reading first, and then doing, and then reading again with the experience of doing behind her. She found a plumber named Dex Garvey through Calhoun, a younger man of about 40 who worked fast and talked very little, which Ruth appreciated. He looked at the pipes, most of which had to be replaced, and gave her a number that was fair, and then did exactly what he said he would do in exactly the time he said it would take. This kind of reliability had become, Ruth reflected, surprisingly rare. She hired a mason named Gerald to look at the mortar in the exterior walls and the chimney above the wood stove. Gerald was 68 and had been laying brick for 45 years, and he walked around the building with his hands in his pockets and a look of practiced assessment before telling her what needed. "Attention. The chimney needed repointing from the top," he said. "The exterior mortar in 2 sections on the north wall needed to be repointed as well. The rest was sound." He said it the way a person says a thing when they have looked at enough old buildings to know the difference between what looks bad and what is bad, and he was correct. The cells were the problem she had been thinking around and was now ready to think through. She had been in the notebook for 3 weeks with the idea. She had drawn it from different angles. She had measured the cells again, more carefully this time, noting the window heights and the door openings and the concrete shelf dimensions. She had read about what other people had done with old jail buildings, converted them to restaurants, to museums, to private homes. None of those were what she was thinking. What she was thinking was a workshop. Not a single large workshop in the way that Elroy Pratt had probably imagined. 1 craftsman with 1 bench and 1 set of tools and a waiting list of customers. What she was thinking was smaller and, she believed, more durable. 6 cells. 6 workstations. The concrete shelves were the right height for a workbench if you added a thick plank top and a face vise. Each cell was the right size for 1 person to work comfortably with hand tools, to have their materials at hand and their tools accessible and enough room to move around the piece without bumping into anything. The iron door of each cell could be removed entirely or swung flat against the wall, opening the cell to the hallway, making the whole lower floor feel continuous while still giving each person a defined space. She had thought about what Vera said about the class Elroy had never taught. She thought about the kind of people in a county like Harnett who might come to learn. Retired men and women with time and patience and the desire to make something with their hands. Younger people who had grown up in a world of screens and flat-pack furniture and had never held a hand plane and might not know they wanted to until they did. People in the middle of their lives who needed something slow and deliberate and real to set against the speed of everything else. She thought about Elroy Pratt's tools on the shelves in the hidden room and the wood he had dried and the waiting list of people who had wanted his chairs and the class he had never had time to teach. She wrote it all down. Then she called Vera Sims. December came in cold and steady. Ruth began making the drive to Harnett Crossing before 7 in the morning, arriving before Calhoun and leaving after him, eating lunch from her thermos at the wooden desk in the entry room. She had brought a small electric heater from home while the wood stove chimney was being repointed, and it kept the entry room just warm enough to work in with her coat on. She had started on the cells. The work was careful and deliberate. She removed the concrete shelf from the first cell herself, using a cold chisel and a hand sledge that Calhoun lent her, working along the edges where the shelf met the wall until the mortar cracked and the shelf came free in sections. It was hard physical work, and she was 78 years old, and she took breaks when her body asked for them and continued when it permitted. She did not hurry. She built the workbench tops from the lumber she found in Elroy's hidden room. She did this with help. She called Vera Sims and asked who in the county might know how to use Elroy's tools well enough to help her prepare the lumber, and Vera gave her a name without hesitation. The name was Pearl Dade. Pearl was 71 and had learned woodworking from her uncle and had been making furniture in her garage for 30 years in the way that some people keep a serious practice entirely private, not from false modesty, but from a simple preference for doing without the need to be seen doing. She arrived at the building on a Wednesday morning and walked through it without saying very much, and then stood in the hidden room for a long time looking at the tools on the shelves. "Those are good planes," she said. "They are," Ruth said. Pearl took the largest of the bench planes from the shelf. She held it in both hands and looked at the iron and ran her thumb lightly across the edge and set it back. "I can get that lumber flat," she said, "and I'll help you with the bench tops if you want them done properly." "I want them done properly." Pearl came back the following Saturday with her own tools, a second set she carried in a canvas roll, and she and Ruth worked side by side in the hidden room, jointing the edges of the cherry planks for the bench tops with Elroy's joiner plane, passing it back and forth between them, checking the edges for square and flat. The work required patience and attention, and the room was cold, but the work itself was warm, in the way that physical work done well is always warm regardless of the temperature. They did not talk very much while they worked. This suited both of them, Pearl said, at one point, while she was checking a plank edge with a straight edge. "You know, this is the first time these planes have been used since whenever he put them away." "I know," Ruth said. Pearl ran the straight edge along the edge of the plank once more. "They feel good," she said. "He kept them up properly." Ruth was at the Shavings horse with a draw knife, working a leg tenon for the first workbench. She had learned the draw knife in the past 2 weeks from watching Pearl, and from a book she had found in the county library, and from the particular kind of learning that comes from simply doing the thing wrong enough times that you eventually understand what right feels like. She said, "I want you to teach here. When it's ready." Pearl looked up from her plank. "Elroy was going to run a class," Ruth said. "He never got to. I want this building to be where that happens." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a teacher," she said. "You've been teaching me for 2 Saturdays." Pearl looked at the tools on the shelves. Then she looked at the hidden room around them, the low ceiling, the wood floor, the shelves full of things that had been waiting in the dark. "What would you call it?" she asked. Ruth thought for a moment. "The Pratt workshop," she said. Pearl picked up the joiner plane again and ran it along the edge of the plank. A long, thin curl of cherry rose and fell to the floor. "All right," she said. December moved toward its end. The upper floor was now fully wired. The plumbing was complete. The wood stove had been cleaned and the chimney repointed, and Gerald had pronounced it safe, and Ruth had built a fire in it on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of December and sat in the upper room in the light of it with a cup of tea from her thermos and looked at the room around her, the bare plank floor, the cleaned windows now letting in the low winter light. The walls still rough and needing paint, but the space itself already transformed by the fire and the light into something that felt inhabited rather than abandoned. She thought about Harold. She thought about him not with grief exactly, but with the more complicated feeling that comes when you realize, late and without bitterness, that a life shared with someone was still in some important way a life that had not yet been fully yours. Harold had been a good man. She did not revise that. But she understood now, sitting in the upper room of a building she had chosen herself and was making herself, what it felt like to be in a space that existed entirely because of her own decision. It felt different, quieter in some way that was not about sound, more solid. She looked at the fire for a long time. Then she heard a knock at the iron door below. She went downstairs. Through the small window set high in the iron door she could see, in the early winter dark, the shape of two men. She recognized the taller one, even in silhouette. Marcus. She opened the door. They were both there. Marcus in his good coat, his breath making clouds in the cold air. Joel behind him, his hands in his pockets, looking at the exterior of the building with an expression she could not fully read. Marcus looked at her. Mom. Yes. His eyes moved past her into the building. Into the entry room with its cleaned floor and the electric light now working in the ceiling and the wooden desk still against the wall. Past her to the hallway where the cells were in various stages of transformation. You've been here this whole time, he said. Most days. He looked at her. His expression had something in it she had not seen from him in some years. Not quite uncertainty. The thing that comes before uncertainty when a person who has been confident of something begins to realize that their confidence was not built on the ground they thought it was. The real estate agent said you won't return calls. I've been busy, she said. Joel spoke from behind Marcus, his voice careful. Mom, this place doesn't have any heat. It has a wood stove upstairs, she said. Come in if you want to talk. She turned and walked back inside. After a moment, she heard them follow. She led them up the stairs to the upper room. The fire was still going, and the room was warm in the uneven way of wood stove heat, warmer near the stove and cooler toward the windows, but warm enough. She poured tea from her thermos into the two spare cups she kept on the windowsill for Calhoun and Pearl and handed one to each of her sons. Marcus held the cup and looked at the room. He looked at the clean floor and the good windows and the fire in the iron stove and the light it put on the plank walls. He looked for a long time. What are you doing with it? He asked. She told them about the workshop, about Elroy Pratt and the hidden room and the tools and Pearl Dade and the class that had never been taught. She told them about the 6 cells and the 6 workstations and the bench tops of cherry and walnut. She told them about Vera Sims and the table that was still in her room at Cedarview, and about what Elroy had said that he only needed what was fair and the work was its own payment. Marcus listened without interrupting. Joel listened. Outside, snow had begun, the first real snow of December, falling past the window in slow, purposeful flakes, and the firelight caught it briefly before it fell past into the dark. When she finished, Marcus looked at his cup, then at the fire. You could have told us, he said. She looked at him steadily. You had already decided. He did not argue with that. He held the cup with both hands and looked at the fire, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not with the speed of a revelation, but with the slow settling of a man who has realized he was wrong about something and is now deciding how to hold that realization. Joel said, quietly, the cells. You're turning them into workstations. Yes. He nodded slowly. He was looking toward the stairs as if trying to see the lower floor in his mind. The engineer part of him, Ruth thought, was already running the calculations. The ventilation down there would need to be looked at, he said. If people are working with wood, there's going to be dust. Ruth looked at her younger son. I know, she said. I could look at it, he said. If you wanted. I know some people. She looked at him for a long moment. Joel had always been the quieter of the two. He had always followed Marcus into things, and then done the actual work of them more carefully than Marcus knew. She had watched this for 37 years. She said, I would like that. The snow continued outside the window. The fire continued in the iron stove. Her 2 sons sat in the upper room of the building their mother had bought for $6 and was turning, with her own hands and with the tools of a dead man who had believed in patient work, into something none of them had imagined. Marcus said, after a while, I didn't know you could do this. Ruth looked at the fire. I didn't entirely know either, she said, but I was fairly sure there was only one way to find out. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." She did not answer immediately. She let the word rest in the room with the firelight and the snow outside the window and the weight of the past several months. Then she said, "I know." It was enough. Not everything was settled in that room on that evening, and Ruth was not a woman who confused a moment of feeling with the work of repair. But something had opened that had been shut, and that was a beginning, which was all a beginning ever needed to be. She poured the last of the tea into her own cup, and they sat together in the warm room while the snow fell past the window, and outside, the old building settled around them in the dark, no longer empty, no longer forgotten, beginning, with slow and patient certainty, to become what it was always meant to be. January came in the way January comes to that part of North Carolina, not with the dramatic cold of further north, but with a persistent gray chill that settled into everything and refused to leave. The mornings were dark longer than they should have felt, and the afternoons gave up the light earlier than was fair, and the county roads ran with a thin sheet of water that was never quite ice and never quite rain. Ruth drove to Harnett Crossing every morning. The lower floor was transforming itself in the patient way that things transform when the person doing the work refuses to hurry. The first 3 cells were finished. The concrete shelves were gone, replaced by the heavy cherry bench tops that she and Pearl had prepared, planed flat and square, with a face vise mounted to the left end of each one using hardware that Calhoun had sourced from a supplier in Raleigh. The iron doors had been removed from their hinges and set against the back of the hidden room, where Ruth intended eventually to decide what to do with them. Without the doors, the cells opened fully into the hallway, and the hallway opened into something that felt continuous and purposeful, a series of connected spaces rather than a series of enclosures. Pearl came on Saturdays and sometimes on Thursday evenings after her other work was done. She and Ruth had developed the particular rhythm of people who work together well, not because they are alike, but because they have each learned where the other one moves and what the other one needs without either of them having to announce it. Pearl did not offer opinions unless she had been asked. Ruth asked often. Pearl answered directly and without qualification. This was a form of respect that Ruth had not always been shown, and she valued it accordingly. Joel had come back 3 times since the December evening in the upper room. He had looked at the ventilation situation in the lower floor and made calls and arranged for a dust collection system to be installed before the cells were in use, a practical and unglamorous contribution that he accomplished without ceremony and without expecting to be thanked excessively. Ruth thanked him once, properly, and he nodded and moved on, which was the right response. Marcus had not come back. Ruth did not press him. She understood that the kind of apology Marcus had offered in the upper room that evening had cost him something real, and that what came after a real apology was not immediate ease but a period of adjustment, of a person learning to inhabit a new understanding of themselves. She was willing to give him time. She had learned, in 78 years, that patience extended toward other people is not the same as letting other people determine the terms of your life. The first is generosity. The second is something else entirely. She no longer confused them. The 4th and 5th cells were finished in the 2nd week of January. The 6th, the one closest to the hidden room at the end of the hallway, she left for last and finished alone on a Saturday morning when Pearl was not there, working slowly and carefully through the cold, removing the last concrete shelf, setting the last bench top, mounting the last vise. She stood in the finished cell when it was done and ran her hand along the bench top and felt the smoothness of the cherry under her palm. 6 workstations, 12 feet of hallway connecting them. At the end of the hallway, the hidden room with its shelves of tools and its photograph on the wall and the wood that was still, after all this time, waiting. She had ordered more tools, not to replace Elroy's, which remained on their shelves and would be used in the classes as they had always been used, with care and with attention and with the understanding that a good tool properly maintained will outlast several generations of the people who use it. She had ordered a second set of the most necessary planes and chisels, because 6 students working simultaneously needed more than one set of tools to share, and because she intended the workshop to be used seriously, not decoratively. She had paid for them from the savings she had brought out of the marriage. Not all of them. Enough. She had kept a careful accounting of what the building had cost her in materials and labor, and she knew exactly where she stood, and she was not afraid of the number. The upper floor was finished in late January. Pearl had helped her paint the walls a warm white that made the most of the winter light coming through the now unboarded windows. The wood stove was clean and functional, and Ruth had laid in a half-cord of seasoned oak from a man named Burkett who farmed 40 acres 3 miles outside of town and delivered the wood himself in a flatbed truck and stacked it against the back wall of the building without being asked. The upper floor would be the gathering space. Tables and chairs, eventually. A place to eat lunch, to have a cup of coffee before beginning work, to look at a finished piece and talk about it. Ruth had made the first 4 chairs herself. Not alone. Pearl had guided her through each step, but with her own hands, from her own decisions, using Elroy Pratt's mortise chisels and draw knife, and the spoke shave that she had learned, over the course of December and January, to use with some proficiency. The chairs were not perfect. She knew that. The back legs of the second one were not quite parallel, and the seat weaving on the third was tighter on one side than the other. But they were solid and they were honest, and when Pearl sat in the fourth one and rocked it gently from side to side on the plank floor, and said it would last 30 years, Ruth believed her. She put the 4 chairs around one of the tables in the upper room. On the 1st of February, she drove to Sea to View on Route 9 and went to Vera Sims's corner room and said, "It's ready." Vera looked at her for a moment. Then she began the slow process of getting out of her chair, and Ruth offered her arm, and Vera took it without ceremony, and they walked together down the hallway of the assisted living facility and out to Ruth's car. The drive to Harnett Crossing took 40 minutes. Vera sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched the county go by outside the window. She did not say very much. Ruth did not fill the silence. They had reached the kind of understanding, in their several visits and long conversations, that did not require sound to sustain itself. When they arrived at the corner of Depot Street, Ruth parked the car and came around to help Vera out. They stood together on the sidewalk and Vera looked at the building. The exterior had been cleaned. The brick had been pointed where it needed pointing and washed where it needed washing, and while it was still dark with age and whether it no longer looked defeated. The windows on the upper floor showed light from within. Above the iron door, Ruth had mounted a small sign, plain painted wood with routed letters in a clean, simple font. The Pratt Workshop. Vera stood on the sidewalk and read the sign. She stood there for a long time. Her hand was on Ruth's arm, and Ruth felt the slight increase of pressure that was not a grip, but something closer to an anchor. He would have liked this, Vera said. He would have said it was more than he expected. Ruth said, "It's exactly what he left the tools for. He just didn't know yet who would come." They went inside. Vera walked through the lower floor slowly, stopping at each workstation. She touched the bench tops. She ran her fingers along the edge of a cherry plank the way a person touches something they recognize from a long time ago. She stopped at the entrance to the hidden room and stood there for a moment looking at the shelves, the tools, the photograph on the wall. Ruth had hung the photograph back exactly where she had found it, on the iron peg above the workbench, in the handmade frame with the tight dovetail corners. Vera looked at it for a long time. Then she reached out and touched the frame very lightly with 2 fingers, just at the corner, just briefly. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Ruth led her upstairs. She helped her into one of the 4 chairs around the table. She made tea on the small camp stove she had been using until the proper kitchen was sorted, and she set a cup in front of Vera and sat across from her in one of the other chairs. Vera looked at the chair she was sitting in. She rocked it slightly. "You made this," she said. "I made all 4. Vera looked at the joints where the back legs met the seat rail. At the woven seat. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The seat weaving is tighter on the left side." "I know," Ruth said. Vera rocked the chair again. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It holds." They drank their tea, and the winter light came through the clean windows, and the wood stove was warm, and outside on Depot Street, they could hear the occasional sound of a car passing and someone calling to someone else across the way, and the ordinary sounds of a small county town continuing its business in the cold. The first class met on a Saturday morning in the middle of February. 6 people. Pearl had helped Ruth put together the announcement, a simple card posted at the library and the feed store and the county extension office, and the 6 spots had been filled in 11 days. 3 men and 3 women, ranging in age from 44 to 73. A retired schoolteacher from Lillington. A man who had worked in construction for 20 years and wanted to know how buildings were made before the machines came. A woman who had bought an old farmhouse and wanted to make furniture for it herself. A recently widowed man named Thomas who said quietly, when asked why he had signed up, that his wife had always wanted a proper chair, and he had never made her one, and he thought it was not too late to make it now, even if she would not be able to sit in it. Ruth had not expected Thomas. She had not expected what his reason would do to the room when he said it. The way the other 5 people went quiet and how the quiet was not uncomfortable, but something more like recognition. The particular recognition of people who have each arrived at a workbench carrying something that they have not said aloud and are perhaps only now beginning to understand how to put down. Pearl taught the first session. She began with sharpening, which is always where to begin, because a dull tool teaches nothing and a sharp tool teaches everything. She moved from bench to bench, student to student, showing each one how to read the edge of a chisel, how to feel the difference between almost sharp and truly sharp, how to work a stone with consistent pressure and consistent angle. She was patient and exact, and she did not make anyone feel foolish for not knowing something they had had no reason to know before. Ruth moved through the room behind her, watching, helping where she could. She watched Thomas learn to hold a chisel. She watched the retired schoolteacher, a woman named Frances, discover that she had a natural feel for the spoke of Chavez, running it along the edge of a practice piece with an intuitive sense of pressure that Pearl recognized immediately and said so. By the end of the morning, all 6 workstations were occupied and all 6 people were working, and the hallway of the old jail building was full of the sound of tools on wood, of shavings falling to the floor, of the particular focused quiet that settles over a room when the people in it are doing something with their hands that requires their full attention. Ruth stood at the entrance to the hallway and looked at it. She looked at the 6 people at the 6 benches. She looked at Elroy Pratt's tools in use for the first time in decades. She looked at the cherry bench tops she had helped prepare and the face vices Calhoun had helped mount and the dust collection system Joel had arranged, and the photograph at the end of the hallway visible through the open door of the hidden room. Elroy Pratt with his plane in his right hand looking at whatever was on his bench in front of him. She looked at all of it and she did not cry, because she was not a woman who cried easily, and because what she felt was not grief or even gratitude exactly, but something larger and simpler than both of those words. Something closer to the feeling of a door swinging open into light after a long time of being closed. It was in the 3rd week of February that Marcus came back. He arrived on a Thursday morning, unannounced, driving himself rather than flying, which meant he had wanted the time of the drive to think. Ruth had learned to read Marcus through the manner of his arrivals. He came through the front door of the building and found her in the hidden room sorting through the remaining stock of Elroy's lumber, assessing what could be used for what. He stood at the door of the hidden room and looked at the shelves. He looked at the photograph. He looked at his mother in her work apron with a piece of figured maple in her hands. He said, "Calhoun Briggs told me what you did with the electrical panel. He said you asked the right questions." Ruth set the maple plank back on the stack. He was generous. Marcus looked at the tools on the shelves. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want to say it correctly, so I'm going to take a minute." She waited. "I thought," he said, "that I was looking out for you. I thought that was what it was." He looked at the bench, at the vise mounted to the wall. "I think I was looking out for my own idea of you. My idea of what you needed and what you were capable of and where you should be. And I was wrong about all of it." He looked at her. "I didn't see you," he said. "I'm sorry for that." Ruth looked at her son. He was 52 years old, and he had his father's shoulders and her father's eyes, and he was standing in a hidden room in a building no one had believed in, being honest in a way that did not come easily to him, and doing it anyway. She said, "I know you were trying to help. I know that's where it started." He nodded. She said, "What you need to understand is that I am not finished. I was never finished. I had more left to do than either of us knew, and I needed the room to find out what it was. That's all. That's what I needed." Marcus looked at the photograph of Elroy Pratt. He looked at it for a long moment. "Who was he?" he asked. "A man who left something good behind," Ruth said, "for someone he didn't know yet." Marcus looked at the tools, at the cherry and walnut, and figured maple stacked carefully on the floor, at the mortise chisels in their rack with the leather grip tape on the handles, still sharp, still ready. He said, "Is there anything you need help with?" Ruth thought for a moment. "The sign out front needs a proper mounting bracket," she said. "The one I used is not going to hold through the spring storms." Marcus nodded. "I can do that." She handed him the level from the workbench. He took it without comment and went out to look at the sign. Ruth stood alone in the hidden room for a moment. She looked at Elroy Pratt's photograph, at the man who had brought his tools here for safekeeping, who had believed that patient work done honestly would find its way to someone who would understand it, who had left the wood stickered properly in the dark because good wood properly prepared will wait. She thought about what she had left behind when she drove to Harnett Crossing that first Tuesday morning, the house she had lived in for 41 years, the marriage, the life that had been arranged around someone else's shape. She had not known then what she was going toward. She had only known that she was not finished. She looked at the tools on the shelves, at the first chair she had made, sitting now in the upper room with its imperfect seat weaving, at the 6 workstations in the hallway and the 6 people who came every Saturday to learn to use their hands for something real, at Vera Sims sitting in that chair with her tea, rocking it gently and saying it would last 30 years. She thought about Thomas, the recently widowed man, who was making a chair for a woman who would never sit in it and who understood, in making it, something that could not be put into words but only into wood and time and patient hands. She understood that this building had not saved her. She had not been saved by Elroy Pratt's tools, or by the $6 she had paid, or by the hidden room, or by Calhoun, Briggs, or Pearl Dade, or Vera Sims, or even by her sons finding their way back to her. She had saved herself, in the way that a person saves themselves, not with a single dramatic act, but with a series of small, daily, deliberate choices to continue. To drive to Harnett Crossing one more morning, to sweep one more room, to open one more door, to write 2 more words in a notebook and mean them. She had kept going. That was all. That was everything. Spring came to Harnett Crossing in March, early and tentative, the way spring comes when it is not entirely certain it is welcome. The elm tree at the corner of the property put out its first small leaves, and the Bradford pears on Route 9 bloomed white against a sky that was finally beginning to suggest blue. The mornings were still cold, but they were cold in the softening way that means the cold is no longer in charge. Ruth opened the upper windows on the first warm Thursday and stood in the room while the air moved through it, replacing the wood stove smell with something greener and looser. She had planted 6 things in clay pots along the windowsill, herbs and small flowering plants, because a room that is being used by people deserves to be tended like a living thing. The classes had grown. Word had spread in the county the way word spreads when a thing is genuinely good and genuinely needed, without announcement, simply by the fact of itself. The Saturday class was full. Ruth had opened a second session on Wednesday mornings, and it had filled in a week. Pearl was teaching both and Ruth was assisting, and they had begun to talk about bringing in a second instructor for the following fall. Thomas had finished his chair in the 4th week of March. He brought it to the Saturday class in the bed of his truck and carried it in himself, and set it at the end of the hallway in front of the hidden room, and stood back and looked at it. It was not a perfect chair. The proportions were slightly heavier than a Pratt chair would have been, the rungs a touch thick, the seat weaving absolutely consistent because Thomas was an exact man and he had woven it and rewoven it twice until it was right. But it was solid and it was honest, and it was made with such evident care that the room went quiet when he set it down. Francis, the retired schoolteacher, said, "That's a beautiful chair." Thomas looked at it for a moment. He nodded once. Ruth looked at the chair and then at the man who had made it, and she thought about what Pearl had said that first Saturday morning, standing in this same hallway, when she had taken Elroy's largest bench plane from the shelf and held it, and said, "They feel good. He kept them up properly." That is what good work is, Ruth thought. Something kept up properly through everything. Something that outlasts the person who made it and finds its way, through time and through the dark and through rooms sealed against forgetting, into the hands of someone ready to continue it. She had not lost everything when her sons sat at her kitchen table with their careful rotating turns and their good intentions. She had thought she had. She had stood in her driveway in the gray cold and watched the taillights disappear around the bend in Sycamore Road, and she had felt the door closing on the life that had been arranged around her. But the door closing behind you is not the end of the hallway. It is only the beginning of the walk toward the door at the other end, the one that has been sealed for a long time, the one that sounds different when you knock on it, the one that swings open on hinges that still work because they were built properly and have been waiting in the dark for someone patient enough to find them. Ruth stood in the hallway of the Pratt workshop on a Thursday morning in late March with the spring air moving through the open windows above her and the tools on the shelves and the photograph on the wall and the 4 chairs around the table in the room upstairs where the fire no longer needed to be lit every day because the season was changing and the building was warm enough now on its own. She was 78 years old. She had $6 in a deed and a building she had made with her hands, and a class full of people learning to make things that would last, and a retired electrician who ate lunch away from home 3 days a week, and a woodworker named Pearl who had kept her practice private for 30 years and was now teaching it, and a woman named Vera who rocked in a chair that wasn't perfect and said it would last 30 years. She had her sons, imperfectly and genuinely, which is the only way anyone ever has anyone. She had a chair in the upper room with a slightly imperfect seat weaving that would last 30 years. She had the name on the sign above the iron door. She had what remained when everything that could be taken was taken, the thing that has no deed and cannot be sold and does not require permission and does not diminish when other people refuse to see it. She was not finished. She had known that all along. She had only needed the room to prove it. Outside on Depot Street, a car slowed, and the driver looked up at the sign above the iron door, reading it, and then drove on. Inside, the morning light moved across the plank floor the way light moves through a room that has been opened after a long time of being closed, finding every corner, making the ordinary extraordinary simply by the fact of being there at all. Ruth picked up her notebook. She opened it to a clean page. She began to write. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.